Hi, Alan. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
A delight to be here.
So as you know, CUTS International is organizing its flagship event, the 7th Biennial Conference on 16th and 17th November 2021. And as you are one of our esteemed speakers and someone who has had a long-term association with CUTS International, I would like to ask your thoughts on the theme of this year's biennial, which is building blocks for an inclusive and resilient economy.
Well, I think the conference this year, and it's the 7th, is probably the most important of all, and that over the whole history of these conferences going back to 2007, CUTS has been a pioneer in thought leadership and giving advice to national governments as well as international bodies as well. And the theme of building blocks for an inclusive and resilient economy are just what's needed in our COVID-ravaged world. I think the first theme of growing markets and power in the market and the need for competition measures to do something about that is especially necessary in the developing world, and countries like India are showing a lot of leadership in this area. We've seen the big getting bigger. We've seen small and medium enterprises being crushed out of the way, and yet for most countries, they are such an important bed for the growth of new businesses to satisfy consumer needs. There are some real questions about whether competition law and policy is up to it. Some countries like Australia have been trying to rein in some of the power of the major digital platforms, but those are gigantic economic interests there, and they're able to fight back to preserve their market power. And I believe that coordinated international regulatory interventions are necessary. And that links really to the second theme as well, equitable access to COVID-19 healthcare. Just recently, the world ticked past that dreadful milestone of more than 5 million recorded deaths from COVID, and we know that there's such a massive imbalance in access to vaccines, to professional health care, and the technology to keep our citizens and consumers safe. And so as a sub-theme of the conference, this is going to be very important. The last conference, in fact, looked at these important issues of intellectual property rights and the restrictions imposed on countries wanting compulsory licensing. And I think that has come to the fore with India and South Africa looking for partial suspensions of the TRIPS agreement for the current time. That becomes another vital thing. I think the last conference set the scene, and there were a lot of action points already underway from that. And I wonder, in fact, if the Indian government's sponsorship of the abeyance of the TRIPS agreement may have come in part from the last CUTS conference. And then on the side of economic growth, the theme of e-commerce for an inclusive global economy is another really powerful message. Around the world, governments, and this includes developing governments, developing country governments, are really looking to e-commerce as a way of supercharging their economies. The process of e-commerce was so important during the COVID crisis for giving access to goods and services to millions of people, and yet that still needs to be expanded a lot. And one big concern from a consumer protection point of view is that the digital platforms and e-commerce have also allowed for all sorts of bad practices as well, fraud and scams and things which have stolen billions in consumer welfare. And so e-commerce is powerful and needs to grow, but the consumer voice must be heard more powerfully. International bodies like the UNCTAD, who have been doing work on this, and the OECD need to redouble their efforts to ensure the good parts of e-commerce are developed, but the bad parts are restricted. And then finally, the fourth theme of income opportunities and jobs couldn't be more important than it is now. Countries who are so dependent on trying to recreate job opportunities for the millions of people who lost their jobs during COVID, and also the massive inequality gaps that the world has thrown up. Now, in my view, a properly administered competition and consumer protection policy are not anti-job. In fact, they are pro-jobs, because vigorous competition in fair and informed markets create economic growth and not a loss. And so while billionaires have doubled their wealth during this time of COVID, consumers have suffered more and more. We need small and medium enterprises to grow, and we need to get together to come up with an inclusive plan for the future. I'm really looking forward to this CUTS conference.
Thank you so much. Hope the government follows what you have to advise.